Teen Veracity would like to present the topic Gender Selection IVF. Members of our group are Men, Diana, Dharmesh, and Johnny. These are just contributions of each member. This explains topics for each section.
Okay, so we'll start with a brief overview. Human reproduction research has been a ethical and scientifically challenged topic that has been in discussion for the past half century. However, in the 1960s and 1970s, our understanding of the events in human fertilization grew to the point where IVF started. Ultimately, this knowledge led to widely acclaimed first birth of the test tube baby, Louise Brown in England in 1978. In this sentinel birth, IVF birth, the mother had a natural menstruation cycle, and the physicians were able to laparoscopically retrieve a single pre-ovulatory oocyte from the ovary and fertilized it in vitro, transferred the resulting 8-cell blastocyst into her uterus. 3 years after this, the first IVF baby was born in US, and that was actually the 15th worldwide. In this case, rather than rely on one oocyte that would be naturally produced, the mother was injected for several days with human menopausal gonadotropin to induce a couple of follicles in the ovaries to produce oocytes. After this process, term-controlled ovarian stimulation, physicians laparoscopically retrieve the pre-ovulatory oocytes, fertilize them in vitro, and then transfer them around 3 to 5 days back into the mother's uterus. And in 1985, the first IVF baby was born in Missouri to a couple who underwent IVF at Washington University. Today, IVF actually accounts for millions of births worldwide. Roughly 1 to 3% of all births every year in US and Europe is because of IVF. And the increasing demand for fertility treatment drives even more research and development in this area. The topic of gender selection brings about in history, the first and the oldest type of sperm separation actually was in 1970s. And the method that this couple, Matthew and Beth, chose gave them about a 60% chance of having a boy, according to their fertility doctor. And what they do is they just centrifuge the sample, and that separates the Y and the X sperms. And we'll talk a little bit about this later. Next slide.
Okay. I will be discussing the IVF process. It begins with superovulation and then removal of the ova, sperm collection, uniting the sperm and egg, then transferring the embryo in uterus, and lastly, confirming pregnancy. IVF is often used in older women with fertility issues, women with damaged or blocked fallopian tubes, women with endometriosis, male infertility caused by low sperm count or blockage. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is a general overview of the IVF process. I'm going to go ahead and begin to discuss step 1, which is superovulation. It is facilitated by drugs which contain follicle-stimulating hormone and is often administered orally or IM. As a result, hormones will cause the body to produce more than one egg per month. During the initial step, transvaginal ultrasounds and hormone labs will often be done for monitoring. In step 2, the egg is retrieved. This step begins with enhanced maturation of the ovums by hormone enhancement. Once the eggs are mature, a follicular aspiration is performed, and it is done often in an outpatient setting. The procedure is ultrasound guided, and a small aspiration needle is used to extract the egg one at a time. Next, in the third step, sperm is collected from a partner or donor. The sperm is then put through a spin cycle in order to select the healthiest ones, or the X or Y. Then the sperm and egg are united. The fourth step consists of embryo culture. This process involves insemination, which occurs in a petri dish. It usually takes a few hours for the sperm to fertilize an egg. The sperm may also be directly inserted into the egg, a process known as intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. Next, in the fifth step, progesterone is administered to prepare the woman's uterine lining to receive the embryos. Several days after fertilization has occurred, multiple embryos will be placed in the uterus using a catheter. Sometimes more than one embryo ends up implanting, which is why multiple babies are common in women who use IVF. And the last step consists of confirming the pregnancy. All right, next slide.
So on gender selection process, first, when somebody decides to do genetic testing on embryos, IVF is done and embryos develop to the fifth day is when they test it. The embryos are biopsied and frozen, and there's a name called PGS. It's just a term where they evaluate the chromosomal numbers and sex of the baby, and they evaluate all 24 chromosomes. The chromosomal material is actually expanded and the number of chromosomes is counted. In the sixth chromosome, XX or XY, is looked at also. The gender of the baby is discovered, and only the genetically healthy embryos are identified and picked out. At least half of the embryos in many cases have what we call aneuploidy, which means they have an abnormal number of chromosomes. And this could be, an example would be trisomy or monosomy, so Down syndrome or Turner syndrome. In either of these cases, if an implantation occurs of such an embryo, there's a higher chance of miscarriage or abnormal offspring. So the diagnosis after gender selection is correct approximately 90% of the time, but there can be times when the chromosomal material is not reflective of the actual outcome. And it's not rare for this to happen. Estimates from our research show that it's 2 to 16%. Next slide.
Ethics in medicine is essential in all fields of medicine, but it becomes more complicated in gynecology and infertility. Ethical issues in pre-implementation genetic diagnosis, sex selection, and preference, as well as prenatal genetic diagnostic techniques for rearranging spermatozoa are always taken into account. Ethical issues are based on religious views, and also experts have stated that have argued that it's an expression of reproductive rights and it allows couples to create a well-being informed and well-planned family. In gender selection, child neglect is minimized and so is domestic violence. Some of the examples of ethical issues, culture-based, are, for example, in Islamic, it is prohibited to use any type of technology. In Islam, it supports gender or any type of genetic diagnostics. It's supported, it is for beneficial to humans. This is just an example how IVF with PGD for gender selection process is processed. Sex selection is a topic that is frequently discussed in depth, and the question of whether using modern fertility technologies to select the gender of a future child is ethical or not always arises. Those who believe in this issue usually regard it as disobedience to God, and thus it interferes with the natural process of reproduction. In some countries, male gender is preferred, and it could be seen as an issue in Western Europe or North American countries. Also, it is said in human rights that it is sexual discrimination and prejudice, and it creates a type of gender imbalance.
I'm going to talk about faith integration. So in the book of Psalm, okay, so in many cultures, sons are preferred over daughters. This has resulted in countless sex-selective abortions. Professor Alkima's team had reported from 1970 to 2017 the estimates of missing female births from China and India alone were approximately 22.5 million. The tragedy continues with female infanticides, selling of unwanted girls, chronic imbalance of sexes, stolen brides, child marriages, increase in sexual crimes, and etc. Gender selection may sound benign, but it can lead to many unintended consequences. We have to be able to step back and take a look at the big picture. People with no reproductive dysfunction would seek out, travel, and pay tens of thousands of dollars to get what they want. God would not be pleased with these people. He would consider this idolatry. As a society, if we normalize these glorified practices, we could be condoning something more sinister down the line. The sex of the children are not assigned on their own or from the parents. That is the Creator's realm of sovereignty, and the creation must acknowledge. In Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 to 6, Solomon said, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." Next. Okay, so here are additional Bible verses. God's word is clear on who made us. In Psalm 139, verse 13, David sang how God intricately put him together in his mother's womb. And in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, Jeremiah is proclaiming how God had called him from the moment that he was in his mother's womb. God already knew everything about him, and he planned out his life. Next. More than half a century of research and more than 40 years of its heavily criticized clinical introduction, IVF has produced over 8 million children. Over 2.5 million cycles are being performed every year, resulting in over 500,000 deliveries annually. And that is it. Next. We have our references here. Thank you.